So this is our last day on Hume's inquiry, in which we'll talk about his famous argument against miracles, as well as the ending chapter on skepticism and his empirical principles. This essay on miracles was probably the most famous of David Hume's essays during his lifetime. It was circulated independently and purchased and read by a number of Anglican pastors. We'll see why at the end. But it's also regarded to be one of the great masterpieces of English rhetorical essay writing. And we'll see exactly wherein that estimate of its rhetorical greatness lies when we get to the end of it. So it's worthwhile reminding ourselves about the basic principle of Hume's philosophy that's going to come into play as a crucial element in his argument against miracles. And that's his idea of what belief is. Remember, he thinks that belief is a sentiment of force and vivacity. We believe those things that have more force and vivacity. Impressions we tend to believe because they come to us with that fresh force and vivacity that fades as they become ideas, merely paler copies of impressions. And we saw that the three principles, or three great laws of the mind that mimicked Newton's three laws, were really not only laws of association of ideas, but laws for the transference or the momentum of force and vivacity. The force and vivacity of an impression would tend to convey itself or transfer itself to ideas that resembled it, that were contiguous to it or near it in space and time, or that were related to it by constant conjunction in terms of cause and effect. So it was these principles that gave rise to custom and habit, which guided all of our thoughts and beliefs. And we believe something merely on the basis of the force and vivacity of that idea, and the force of that idea, vivacity of that idea, would have resulted from the multiple transfers of the force and vivacity of impressions by these three principles. And of course, there would sometimes be things that would lessen the force and vivacity, or would be suggest belief or add force and vivacity to contradictory ideas. When competing ideas were presented to the mind, we would automatically believe in the one that had the greatest force and vivacity. There would be reflection would be like a balancing or a little fight between the force and vivacity of the different ideas, and we would necessarily believe the idea that had the greater force and vivacity. So let's look at Hume's actual argument. And here I can't stress strongly enough that this is an argument against the possibility of belief in miracles. It's not an argument against the possibility of miracles. Remember Hume's skepticism. We can't know whether it's going to have the sunrise tomorrow. We don't know whether this ball that I let go of is going to drop. We don't know that this hammer is going to break the glass that I hit with it. It's certainly possible, as far as reason is concerned, that those things might happen. I can't believe that those things will happen because of the custom and habit that comes from constant conjunction. So Hume, remember, the key to understanding Hume is to recognize that he simultaneously believes two things that appear to contradict themselves but don't. He believes, on the one hand, that there's no rational basis for causality, and that anything might possibly happen as far as reason is concerned. And yet he also holds the second, only apparently contradictory statement, that it's impossible for us not to believe in the necessity of causation. That impossibility of belief comes from the powerful sentiment that comes from constant conjunction, from custom and habit. And despite the fact that reason tells us that there's no reason, and we're completely skeptical about causation and about the possibility of miracles, custom and habit and our sentiment of belief built up through constant conjunction assures us that it's impossible. Remember Hume's motto, to be a philosopher, yet amidst your philosophy be yet a man. So the rational philosopher part of you tells you that there's no rational basis for causation, that maybe miracles are possible. Maybe my actions won't follow necessarily from their causes and motives. But the man in me, who's governed by custom and habit and psychological laws of belief, will necessarily believe those things and can't help but not believe them. Just as the laws of nature necessitate the physical actions of things, so the laws of belief, the laws of association, of resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect, will psychologically necessitate my belief, despite the fact that there's no rational basis for it. All right, so let's go back to the argument. If we believe that belief is a sentiment arising from the balance of the force and vivacity of sentiments associating with opposing ideas, and if a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, that means it's going to be an exception to a contrary idea or impression that goes against a law of nature. And a law of nature is, by definition, Hume says, a universal and uniform series of constant conjunctions which produces a vast quantity of force and vivacity, and no single impression could possibly counterbalance this force. So if you see a ghost outside your window, just floating there, you've had a long series of constant conjunctions of looking out your window and not seeing anything, and of seeing heavy objects fall to the ground and not just float there. So many different experiences of this sort that it's almost impossible to tally them all up. But your idea of those things, that there's nothing outside your window, that heavy objects will fall, are like banks of force and vivacity. They've been storing up this gigantic balance of belief, this gigantic balance of force and vivacity from an unbroken and uniform series of constant conjunctions. That's what a law of nature is, a vast storehouse of belief, a vast storehouse of universal and uniform constant conjunctions. So one tiny little experience is never going to overwhelm that giant bank of belief. It may make a little small withdrawal from it, a small negative to it, but thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of experiences are never going to be overwhelmed by one simple experience. That's why when we see things out of the corner of our eye or see weird and wondrous things, we don't assume that they're violations of the laws of nature. We assume there must be some other explanation for it. So again, the conclusion is not that miracles are impossible. Again, Hume's skepticism won't allow him to say anything rationally about that. What the conclusion of the argument is that it's impossible to believe in miracles. And we'll see later he'll say that belief in miracles would itself be a miracle, would be a violation of the three great laws of the association of ideas and the transference of the momentum of belief or sentiment or force and vivacity. You can watch this little video from BBC that summarizes Hume's arguments and their cultural significance as well. So Hume says no case of miracles, no matter how well documented, could ever overwhelm the vast storehouse of experience that comes from constant conjunction and that stands behind any law of nature. An example he gives is an 18th century set of miracles that were around the tomb of a famous priest, Paris, Abbé Paris. And at this tomb, there were a group of people called the convulsionaires who would go into convulsions and apparently would be cured of a wide variety of ailments like paralysis, cancer, and blindness and other things. You can read about it on Wikipedia at the link there if you wanted to. And Hume says, despite the fact that there were hundreds of witnesses to these supposed miracles, he thinks that no one, upon hearing all of these reports, and even though the people who reported them were relatively trustworthy, he thinks that no eyewitness testimony of this sort, even to multiple persons and from trustworthy persons, can ever counterbalance that vast storehouse of belief that comes from constant conjunction in the laws of nature. So it seems almost impossible that we could ever come to have a contrary sentiment that would counterbalance the laws of nature, which come from long and uniform experiences of things following those laws. So there are other arguments that Hume gives against believing in miracles, although the main one is the one that I've just given. He thinks that there really are no accounts of miracles with sufficient testimony under clear conditions which would allow everyone to see it. Even in the example that I've seen, the conditions aren't so clear that we're really sure that miracles have been performed. We don't really know and haven't tested whether the cancer and the blindness have really receded and whether it wasn't some type of fraud designed to gain charitable contributions or get people to come to the shrine. He also thinks that human testimony of this sort has little value since it's motivated by other motives rather than truth. We saw that we might suggest that there was a motive of profit or popularity or attention given to wonderful stories and miraculous stories. And there are lots of emotions and desires and practical advantages to telling stories about miracles. So when we hear someone say something like that, we very rarely believe it. We'll talk about this particular other argument in just a second, since it's going to explain why indeed we hear so many accounts of miracles and why some accounts of miracles seem to be believed, despite the fact that Hume thinks it's impossible according to his psychological laws. Third of all, he thinks that miracles are most popular only in ignorant and barbarous nations. And as a society advances in science and rationality, he thinks it decreases in its belief in miracles. He also thinks that there's no testimony in any religion for its own miracles that isn't opposed by many other witnesses. And what he has in mind here is that religious miracles that call upon Christian saints and Christian gods as the God are opposed by miracles of bodhisattvas in Buddhism or of Hindus or of Islamic miracles that suggest that theirs is the true God and not the Christian God. So these are some other examples of arguments, but the main argument is the one that we've just said that involves the nature of belief. So if that's true, if Hume's argument is correct, and in fact it's impossible psychologically for people to believe in miracles, then why are there so many miraculous stories, and why do many religions seem to believe in miracles? Hume here introduces an important principle that he'll use in his moral theory and his theory of beauty or aesthetics, and we'll talk about those later in the course. He thinks that sentiment of belief, of the force and vivacity of our ideas, is only one force in our minds that's opposed by many, many other types of forces. So there's other types of pleasures and desires, like wonder, pleasure, amazement, novelty, attention. There are lots of reasons why it would be pleasant to tell fairy stories or to talk about wondrous and mysterious tales, just as there's lots of reasons why people like to gossip independent of the truth of that particular story. So if we wondered, why is it that publications like the Weekly World News that tell things about aliens and mermaids and human beings turning back into apes, I don't think anybody believes that this is an accurate picture, that people were turning back into apes, or that we really did discover mermaids in a cemetery. I think that in these cases people read it for the pleasure, for the entertainment value, for other psychological reasons, besides the set of custom and habits that come from the three great laws that determine our beliefs. So Virginia Woolf, the 20th century novelist, had said that reason is that faintest or weakest of sentiments. So Hume would think that our sentiment of belief that comes from the force and vivacity of the impressions is what determines our belief. But there are all kinds of other things that determine our actions. We're not rational creatures, and we're moved by all kinds of feelings, desires, needs, and fancies that might overpower our beliefs and cause us to act in other ways. So there's a distinction between the sentiment of belief that comes from force and vivacity and other types of desires and needs and feelings that might move a human being to practical action in other ways. So we'll see later. We'll see later that will be a principle he uses in his moral and aesthetic theories. That sometimes it's necessary to determine belief, to protect yourself, to be sort of objective, to protect yourself from these other types of motives of pleasure and practical advantage, and just consider the sentiment of belief. So he ends his essay on miracles with one of the great rhetorical flourishes of modern philosophy, and indeed of any English rhetoric. It's a great rhetorical flourish, not only because it summarizes his argument, but because Hume, the great atheist, is managing to get his essay attacking the possibility of believing in miracles. He's succeeding in getting it to be adopted and approved of by a number of Anglican Christian ministers. And in this sentence, he's simultaneously praising them and insulting them in ways that he would have hoped they were not aware of, the insult, that is, that we're not aware of. So he says, mere reason is insufficient to convince us of any story of miracles. Whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience. So there, Hume states his conclusion of his essay as a way of stating the general Protestant principle that faith and belief comes from faith alone, and that's a miracle that only happens through the grace of God, that no human power is capable of getting you to believe in miracles or having faith. But in the previous sentence, he had, we can suspect, satirically said, that we can conclude that the Christian religion was not only at first attended with miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one. So it would be a miracle to believe in it, because it would go against his three laws of belief and of association. And therefore, you could take that to mean that it's a miracle that anyone could believe it, which means that they shouldn't believe it. And yet in the second sentence, he assuages any worries of the Christian ministers by saying that his argument merely shows that any faith that you might have has to come through the miraculous grace of God, and not from any scientific or psychological cause. The very last section of the inquiry is mostly devoted to just summing up Hume's conclusions and point of view, which can be summarized as a type of skepticism, which is continual question and refusal to believe without proof. We saw that modern philosophy started in skepticism with Descartes' method of doubt, breaking down everything and then trying to rebuild up knowledge. And after 2 centuries and 6 great philosophers, they're left with David Hume's conclusion that, in fact, Descartes' project is a failure, that you end up being skeptical of almost all of the truths that Descartes set out to reassure us of and provide foundations for, that come from the sciences. But remember, he advocates only a mitigated skepticism. Remember, he thought that taking that skepticism seriously leads you to depression, like his breakdown as a young man. And remember, he says you should be a philosopher, but amidst your philosophy, be yet a man. So Hume's skepticism is mitigated in that it doesn't affect practical life. He allows practical life to be guided by custom and habit and sentiment and feeling, not by reason, and restricts reason to that academic study of principles. And the main conclusion that he draws in academic philosophy is sometimes called his principle of empiricism, that things only have meaning insofar as they can be traced to impressions. So in one of the most famous quotes from all of modern philosophy, Hume will state an empirical principle that will later be taken by the 20th century movement, logical empiricism, as its critique of metaphysical philosophy. He says, when we run over the libraries, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity school or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Is it relations of ideas? If we say no, then does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact and existence? Does it come from some impression that we see as a matter of fact? If we have to answer no to both of those questions, commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So this skepticism, as the result of the project of modern philosophy, and this critique of metaphysical systems of the type that we saw Leibniz and Spinoza and even Berkeley building, it's going to be that failure of the modern project that is going to wake Kant from his dogmatic slumber. Before we get to Kant, we're going to look at some passages from Hume's treatise, his earlier work, about personal identity and morality.